there is a quiet, almost invisible decision you make each morning before you speak, before the world asks anything of you. To move or to remain, to act with purpose or drift like a leaf on a stream, that single, tiny choice, brushed off as trivial, repeated 1,000 times, builds the architecture of your life. Imagine, for a moment, that the life you will live in 10 years is not the result of sudden revelations or heroic efforts, but the cumulative weight of these small, ordinary decisions. If that is true, then mastery is less a mountain to climb than a garden to tend, where patience, removal, and steady hands shape futures. Long before modern self-help charts and motivational speeches, a certain kind of mind cultivated this understanding with a clarity that was ruthless and precise. Miyamoto Musashi, the Ronin who walked in the 17th century like a man who had learned to read the edges of the wind, wrote in the Book of Five Rings that strategy is born of discipline, repetition, and an ability to see what most cannot, the long consequence of the small. Musashi did not rely on sudden inspiration. He sharpened himself through countless quiet rituals, practices that reoriented perception until his body moved correctly without thought. This is not a story of dramatic feats alone. It is the instruction manual of the ordinary moment. To examine how such centuries-old thinking reshapes a modern life, consider the story of Hiro Tanaka, a 35-year-old software engineer who lived in a city that never truly slept. His work required constant attention, and the culture around him praised busyness as virtue. Each evening he returned to an apartment that held the ghosts of undone intentions, a guitar that gathered dust, a manuscript he had begun in quieter times, and a persistent sense that time was leaking through small, avoidable holes. He was not a man of dramatic flaws. He was simply compliant to convenience, letting defaults decide how he ate, moved, and spoke to himself. His yearning was not for spectacle, but for steadiness, a quiet presence he could call his own. One winter morning, after months of simmering discomfort, Hiro found an old passage by Yagyu Munenori. Munenori, a daimyo's sword instructor and thinker, taught that the heart of the warrior is a stillness that acts, not a stillness that is inactive. He spoke of forming habits that are like a well-tuned instrument. The words struck Hiro not as a battle cry, but as permission. Permission to remove the clutter of choices and to commit to a few non-negotiable acts. He began small. He decided, simply, that each morning he would sit in silence for 7 breaths before turning on his phone. This was not a dramatic vow. It was a tiny refusal of the world's demand for his attention. On the first day, he felt foolish. The second day, curiosity. By the 10th, a subtle clearing. Those breath-centered moments did not produce instant enlightenment. They produced something quieter. The ability to notice how he moved through the day, how his hand reached for distraction, how a single choice bent the arc of his hours. What followed was deliberate contraction. He removed streaming services he rarely used, deleted a handful of social apps that lured him into continuous partial attention, and established a non-negotiable rule: no screens for the first hour after waking. Each elimination mattered less for its severity and more for the message it sent to his identity. He was someone who guarded his attention. This kind of small, daily pruning follows a pattern the samurai understood well. Tsukahara Bokuden taught that mastery grows by eliminating the unnecessary. The honest practitioner strips away the ornamental until only what is essential remains. Bokuden did not glorify expansion. He praised the discipline of subtraction. For Hiro, this meant designing systems rather than relying on willpower. He set a simple, Repeatable morning, breath, water, 2 pages of reading and a short practice with his guitar strings. He did not overcommit. He made each component so small that refusal became more effortful than compliance. Over weeks, his mornings shifted from reactive to intentional. This small design had a rippling consequence. He approached work with steadier focus, decisions felt rooted, and his capacity to sit with discomfort without reflexive distraction grew. The principle is not merely about adding routines, but about forging identity through repetition. Sasaki Kojiro, known more for his tragic duel than for doctrine, embodied a paradox. Technique refined the craftsman until his movements were indistinguishable from his self. When Hiro picked up his guitar for 3 minutes each day, he did not set out to master the instrument overnight. Instead, he shouldered the small act until it became a quiet declaration. I am someone who learns. Identity forms when the tiny, non-negotiable acts press into the clay of character. Each repetition signals to the mind and body who you are. We must consider resistance not as a barrier, but as information. In the practice halls of old, a young student's limbs trembled, not because the path was wrong, but because the body was recalibrating. The moment you choose the small discipline, friction arises. It is inevitable and instructive. Hiro confronted a different kind of opponent, the seductive ease of surrender. On some nights he would return exhausted and skip his rituals, slipping back into passive consumption. He learned to meet those lapses without grand self-reproach. A lesson from the Zen-infused samurai tradition is to observe the failure with quiet attention, to accept it, and to return to practice without letting the lapse rewrite identity. This is how the warrior's perseverance differs from stubbornness, through adaptive return rather than punitive self-flagellation. There is another skill the ancients valued above all: presence. Musashi's idea of timing is not about aggression, but about being wholly within the present movement, untroubled by the echo of past failures or the siren call of future fantasies. For Hiro, building presence meant narrowing his field of choices. He learned to apply the samurai principle of wabi-sabi, not as aesthetic, but as discipline. Appreciate the imperfect process and keep the edge honed. He replaced the idea of productivity with presence in each small act. When he brushed his teeth, he brushed them fully. When he ate, he tasted. These micro-commitments multiplied into an altered perception. Days became coherent rather than scattered, and his sense of agency grew not because he accomplished more, but because he experienced more of what he did accomplish. A crucial distinction in applying warrior wisdom to modern life lies in the method of elimination. The samurai did not practice asceticism for its own sake. They removed unnecessary choices to throttle the mind's constant fluctuation and to free energy for deliberate action. For Hiro, the pruning extended beyond habits. He examined relationships that demanded constant emotional labor without reciprocity, and conversations that pulled him into habitual reactions. He did not cut people off cruelly, but he set boundaries that reflected his capacity. This was not a technique of avoidance. It was a discipline of allocation, deciding where his attention and energy would be spent. The consequence was a life less entangled, more directed. Discipline, as taught by Yagyu Munenori, is not enforced through external force, but through the forging of systems that make correct action inevitable. Consider the rule Hiro made for his work. He would write the day's single most important task on a small card and place it by his keyboard before opening his laptop. This trivial-looking artifact became an anchor, reminding him of one primary aim. He would not allow email to define his day. That one card, replaced every evening, created a discipline of focus. He was not perfect. He failed some days. Yet the system reduced the need for constant choice. It was a shrewd application of the samurai mind. Structure your environment so that the right action flows from the situation, rather than from sporadic force. The inner landscape of discipline cannot be divorced from surrender. This may seem contradictory, but the samurai knew the paradox well. Surrendering to the process is itself an act of power. Musashi's practice of no mind, moving without the interference of anxious calculation, requires surrender to training. Hiro learned to trust tiny acts by giving himself over to repetition. He surrendered to the process of making small decisions day after day, not as a means to an immediate outcome, but as an apprenticeship to himself. Over months, something shifted. Decisions that had once felt heavy became automatic, and an inner quiet replaced the earlier agitation. He practiced with the humility of a craftsman, not the impatience of a seeker. Silence plays a central role in this transformation. Samurai cultivated silence as a form of intelligence. Silence is not emptiness. It is a space where the mind aligns with reality and sees what truly matters. Hiro's deliberate mornings of breath and stillness became a well of calm he could draw from. When faced with a worded provocation at work or the pull to compulsive scrolling, that well reminded him that there is no urgency to answer every impulse. Silence sharpened his discernment. It created a default pause between stimulus and reaction. The pause allowed him to choose with intention rather than reflex. There is also a moral dimension to the tiny choices. Bushido, the way of the warrior, associated honor not with spectacle but with faithfulness to one's principles. This faithfulness is not a grand ethical pronouncement, but a practice enacted in small ways. Keeping one's word in trivial matters, arriving on time, making a promised call. For Hiro, this meant restoring small promises he had broken to himself. If he committed to 3 pages of reading before bed, he read them, not because they were heroic, but because they affirmed his capability to keep a promise. Such small acts rebuilt trust between his present self and his future self, sealing a continuity that is easily eroded by neglect. Transformation requires an honesty that many avoid. The samurai tradition demands clear-eyed appraisal of one's weaknesses. Hiro confronted his truth. He wanted meaning, but had outsourced his days to convenience. He accepted responsibility. Acceptance did not excuse inaction. It opened a route to deliberate redesign. This is the essential work. Acknowledge where you have been complicit in your drift, and then design a life that constrains the possibility of drift. The discipline of constraints, setting limits, was a favorite tool among these masters. By limiting his options, Hiro discovered freedom, the freedom to be consistent, to develop skill, and to protect essential energy. We now confront a practical question that often haunts those who seek change: how to begin without becoming overwhelmed. The samurai answer is precise. Choose one non-negotiable, make it so small that resistance is mechanical, and allow identity to grow from it. Do not ask for transformation in a single day. Ask for a single, repeatable act. Let that act attach itself to your body's memory. When it becomes habitual, choose another and another. This is the patient arithmetic of mastery. Musashi described strategy as a cumulative formation of small, right choices. No single act is miraculous. The miracle is in the accumulation. There will be moments of doubt. There will be mornings when the bed feels like a warm harbor, and the world outside waits with an indifferent calendar. In those hours, remember that discipline is not the absence of temptation, but the capacity to direct attention toward an intention you have chosen to honor. The ancient teachers did not promise ease, they promised clarity. The clarity to see which small acts mattered, the patience to practice them each day, and the humility to return after failure. Over the course of a year, Hiro's life looked less like a dramatic overturning and more like a slow recentering. His days contained fewer erratic peaks and troughs. His attention was better guarded. His relationships felt steadier. He did not become a monk, nor did he win any great accolades. What changed was less visible, but more enduring, an inner coherence. His small decisions had tightened into habit. His habits had impressed an identity. The future that once seemed a hazy divergence resolved into a discernible path. The lesson these samurai principles teach is not to make life arid or joyless. Rather, they suggest the cultivation of edges where meaning can grow. Discipline is not punishment. It is the art of saying no to the countless trivialities that erode time and yes to a few practices that shape destiny. To live by such laws is to accept trade-offs, fewer distractions, deeper presence, and the slow accrual of capability. In this economy, small decisions are the seeds from which a future harvest grows. If you were to carry one practical instruction from these teachings into your days, let it be this: choose one tiny, non-negotiable action that affirms the person you intend to become. Practice it with humility and without fanfare. When resistance appears, observe it, learn from it, and return without drama. Trim the unnecessary. Construct simple systems that make correct action the path of least resistance, and cultivate silence as a place of return. Over time, the accumulation of these small decisions will yield a life not of spectacle, but of quiet integrity. In the end, the samurai's true weapon was not the sword, but the disciplined attention that shaped each small movement. Your life will be no different. The future is not an event waiting to happen. It is the result of the tiny choices you honor every day. Choose them with the gravity of a warrior and the patience of a gardener, and you will find that the life you imagined arrives not suddenly, but steadily, built upon countless moments kept